P-38 waits on the runway. Its pilot is 23. 6 missions. 0 kills. Everyone thinks they know why P-38 seconds were dying in 1943. Bad tactics. Bad pilots. Wrong doctrine. That explanation is wrong. The real reason was 6 inches of wire that engineers approved, manuals allowed, and pilots paid for with their lives. Inside the aircraft, a control cable was late by a fraction of a second, small enough to pass inspection, long enough to get men killed. A mechanic saw it. No officer did. What happened next was never meant to exist. No authorization, no paperwork, no credit. Just a forbidden fix that quietly reversed kill ratios and turned the hunter into the hunted. If you stay to the end, you'll understand how a harmless tolerance changed the air war and why the people who fixed it were never supposed to be remembered. At the beginning of 1943, the P-38 Lightning was supposed to be the answer. On paper, it was everything American pilots needed in the Pacific. Twin engines, heavy firepower, high-altitude performance, speed the Japanese couldn't match in a straight line. Against the Mitsubishi Zero, the P-38 was not meant to turn. It was meant to dive, strike, climb, and disappear. That doctrine was repeated endlessly in briefings, in training, in manuals written thousands of miles from combat, and according to those manuals, when pilots died, the cause was clear. They flew it wrong. But by mid-1943, something didn't add up. Pilots were dying even when they followed the rules. They dove with speed. They attacked from altitude. They avoided turning fights as long as they could. And still, Zeros kept ending up on their tails. Not once or twice, but consistently. In the Southwest Pacific, 5th Air Force squadrons began to bleed aircraft at an alarming rate. P-38 seconds were being lost week after week, often in engagements that looked identical in the after-action reports. Same setup, same tactics, same outcome. The Zero would bait the American pilot into a maneuver. The pilot would try to roll out and escape, and the Zero would already be there every time. The official explanation was simple. Pilot hesitation. Pilot misjudgment. Pilot error. That explanation satisfied headquarters. It did not satisfy the men on the flight line, because they were the ones who watched pilots climb into aircraft in the morning and watched too many of them never come back. Technical Sergeant James McKenna had been maintaining P-38 seconds in New Guinea for 8 months, long enough to stop believing neat explanations. McKenna didn't fly. He didn't attend briefings. He didn't sit in ready rooms debating tactics. He worked where the aircraft lived, on the ground, with panels open, hands on metal and cable. Every morning, he inspected the same systems. Every morning, he signed off on aircraft that met specifications, and every few days, one of those aircraft didn't return. Pilots talked to him when officers weren't around. They said the same thing, quietly, almost apologetically. The airplane felt slow, not slow in speed, slow in response. They would pull the stick, and the aircraft would obey, but not immediately, just a moment late, just long enough for the Zero to cut inside the turn. At first, McKenna assumed it was nerves, then fatigue, then imagination, until he felt it himself. Inside the P-38, the aileron control cables ran a long, complicated path through the twin booms, pulleys, linkages, turns. It was a robust system, reliable, and built with tolerances, factory tolerances. At full deflection, the system allowed a small amount of slack, not much, a fraction of an inch. According to engineering documents, it was acceptable. According to inspection checklists, it was correct. But when McKenna tensioned the cables by hand, he could feel it. That brief dead zone before resistance kicked in. In most conditions, it didn't matter. At high speed, the forces smoothed it out. But in a low-speed, high-G turning fight, the kind Zero pilots forced Americans into, that fraction of a second was everything. It meant the difference between rolling inside a turn and being predicted. Zero pilots didn't need to be faster. They just needed to be earlier. and the P-38 was giving them that advantage for free. McKenna mentioned it once, carefully, to an engineering officer. The response was immediate and final. Cable tension was within spec. The slack was allowed. Changing it would void approvals. Field mechanics were not authorized to modify flight control systems. The conversation ended there. From the system's point of view, the aircraft was fine. From McKenna's point of view, men were dying for something the system refused to see. By early August, the pattern was impossible to ignore. Pilots with experience were dying the same way rookies did. Different squadrons, different days, same ending. They rolled. The aircraft lagged. The Zero didn't. The manuals blamed the dead. The paperwork stayed clean, and the slack stayed exactly where it was. Small enough to pass inspection, large enough to fill graves. McKenna understood something then. This was not a problem the system was going to fix, because officially there was no problem. And if nothing changed, the next pilot walking toward a P-38 would be another name added to a list no one wanted to question. That was when McKenna began thinking about a solution no one had approved, and no one had asked for. A solution small enough to hide, simple enough to build, and dangerous enough to end his career if discovered. All it would take was 6 inches of wire, and the decision to stop obeying rules written by people who weren't there to watch men die. The first pilot McKenna lost was easy to explain. That's what everyone said. New arrival, few combat hours. Bad luck. The second one was harder. The third made people uncomfortable. By the time the 5th P-38 failed to come back, the explanations stopped sounding confident and started sounding rehearsed. One of them was Lieutenant David Chen. 3 weeks in theater. Young, careful, by the book. Chen didn't die on his first fight. He came back with bullet holes in the left boom and a story he couldn't shake. He said the Zero got inside his turn. Not because Chen turned too hard, not because he panicked, but because when he tried to roll out and dive, the airplane hesitated. Just a beat, just long enough. McKenna inspected the aircraft himself. Engine timing was perfect. Control surfaces were aligned. Cable tension was within tolerance. Nothing wrong. 3 weeks later, Chen was dead. Different aircraft. Same story. The report read, pilot error during defensive maneuvering. McKenna stopped believing reports after that. The next was Captain William Morrison. Morrison wasn't inexperienced. He was a flight leader. 11 confirmed kills. One of the men pilots listened to. When Morrison went down, the ready room went silent. They had intercepted Zeros at medium altitude. Morrison scored on the first pass. Textbook. Then 2 Zeros reversed on him. Radio traffic captured everything. Morrison called out that his controls felt mushy, that the airplane wasn't responding fast enough. His wingman watched Morrison try to roll inverted and split S away. The Zeros stayed with him through the maneuver. They shouldn't have been able to. Morrison was dead before he hit the ground. Afterward, his crew chief checked the wreckage. Every measurement was within specification. Nothing wrong. The report read, pilot error. That was when the deaths stopped being statistics. McKenna knew Morrison's crew chief, a man named Rodriguez. Rodriguez didn't say much after the crash. He just stared at the aircraft logbooks like they were lying to him. He checked everything, twice, and still came up empty. By mid-August, McKenna had watched 17 pilots die. Some were kids he spoke to every morning. Some were names he only learned after they didn't come back. They all left the same way, walking toward an aircraft that was fine, or attempt to. Those who survived came back saying the same thing. The airplane felt heavy, slow to answer, like it was fighting them. Most pilots assumed that was just the P-38, a big fighter, twin engines, not as nimble as a Zero. McKenna knew better. He could hear it. When he tensioned the control cables, they made a sound, a low, dull twang. Loose cables sounded different from tight ones. Every P-38 on the line sounded the same, not broken, just late. Late enough to get people killed. McKenna mentioned it to Rodriguez one night, quietly, carefully. Rodriguez listened, then asked the question everyone avoided. What can we do? End quote. McKenna didn't answer right away, because officially The answer was nothing. Unofficially, there was something, but saying it out loud meant crossing a line. The manuals were clear. Field mechanics did not modify flight control systems. Any unauthorized change was grounds for court-martial, and yet, every day they followed the rules. Someone died anyway. The problem wasn't that pilots didn't know what to do. They did. Every briefing drilled it into them. Never turn with a zero. Use speed. Use altitude. Hit and run. But combat didn't respect doctrine. Zeros were smart. They learned American habits. They learned timing. They waited for the P-38 to start rolling, then snapped back the other way. They weren't faster. They were earlier. And the P-38 gave them that window every single time. Lieutenant Robert Hayes was the one who finally said it out loud. 23 years old. Farm kid from Iowa. 6 missions. 0 kills. Not because he didn't get shots. Because every time he almost did, the moment slipped away. On his 3rd mission, he dove from the sun like the manual said. Built speed. Lined up a 0. As he pulled lead, the 0 snap-rolled and dove. Hayes followed, and felt the airplane drag through the turn like it was moving through mud. By the time his nose came around, the 0 was gone. On the 4th mission, 2 zeros dove on him while he was repositioning. Hayes tried to roll level and dive away. The airplane responded, but slowly. Slow enough for cannon rounds to punch holes in his right boom. He made it home. Shaken. Silent. On the 5th mission, his wingman died. Hayes heard it over the radio. The panic. The gunfire. The scream. Then nothing. That night, Hayes didn't sleep. Neither did most of the squadron. The bed stayed empty. The logbook said the aircraft was fine. Pilot error. The next evening, Hayes found McKenna on the flight line. He didn't talk about doctrine. He didn't talk about tactics. He asked one question. Is there anything you can do to make it roll faster? It's not DIDES. Anything. Regulation or not. Hayes wasn't asking to win. He was asking to survive. McKenna looked at him and saw the same thing he'd seen too many times. A man who knew the rules were going to get him killed. And for the first time, McKenna didn't hide the truth. He told Hayes to come back in the morning. He would see what he could do. That night, after the hangar lights went dark and the generators hummed, McKenna stayed behind, alone, thinking about a solution no one was supposed to use, and a line he was about to cross that would either save a life or end his career. McKenna worked alone that night. After 23, the maintenance hangar emptied out. Generators hummed in the distance. Insects beat themselves against the lights. The war didn't stop at night. It just got quieter. McKenna waited until the last crew chief left. No witnesses. No questions. He pulled the inspection panel off the left boom of Hayes's P-38. The metal was still warm from the day. Inside, the control cables ran back toward the tail, looping through pulleys like veins. He grabbed the aileron cable with both hands and pulled. There it was. That familiar slack, that brief, sickening dead zone before the tension caught. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't broken. It was exactly what the manuals allowed. McKenna closed his eyes for a moment and thought about the pilots who didn't come back, the ones whose names were already being replaced by new arrivals. He knew what he was about to do, and he knew what it meant if anyone found out. Unauthorized modification of a flight control system, non-standard parts, violation of maintenance regulations, court-martial, dishonorable discharge, possibly prison. But if he didn't do it, Hayes would take off in the morning with the same delay that had killed the others. McKenna reached into his tool bag. The piano wire had come from a wrecked P-38 weeks earlier, 6 inches long, high-tensile steel. He'd kept it without knowing why. Now he did. He sat on the hangar floor with a pair of pliers and began bending the wire into a Z shape. The metal resisted, sprang back. His fingers slipped on the first attempt. On the second, the wire bit into his thumb. Blood welled up, dark against the silver steel. McKenna wiped it on his coveralls and kept working. This wasn't precision engineering. It was field work, the kind that happens when there's no time left. It took 8 minutes to get the bend right. 8 minutes that felt much longer. The Z-shape would act as an inline tensioner, just enough preload to eliminate the slack, not enough to overstress the system. In theory, installing it was harder. The space inside the boom was tight. McKenna had to work one-handed, holding a flashlight with the other. Shadows jumped across the cables as the beam shifted. He disconnected the cable at the pulley junction. The clevis pin slipped from his fingers and vanished into the darkness inside the boom. McKenna froze. If he couldn't find it, he couldn't finish the job. If he couldn't finish the job, he'd have to put everything back exactly as it was. And Hayes would die anyway. McKenna set the flashlight down and reached into the boom blindly. 5 minutes passed. Then another. His shoulder wedged against the structure. A sharp edge dug into his arm. Finally, his fingers closed around the pin. He exhaled, slowly. There was no turning back now. He inserted the piano wire tensioner between the cable end and the pulley. The fit was tight, tighter than anything in the manual. He had to force the clevis pin through. For a moment, he thought it wouldn't seat. Then it did. McKenna pulled on the cable. No slack. He pulled again. The control surface moved immediately. No delay. No dead zone. Perfect. That was the most dangerous part, because perfection meant responsibility. If the modification failed in flight, Hayes wouldn't just die. McKenna would be the reason. He replaced the inspection panel, wiped down the area, cleaned his tools. The hangar clock read 1:15. McKenna washed the blood off his hands at the sink and stared at his reflection in the metal mirror. He looked like every other mechanic on the base. No one would know what he'd done, unless it worked. He walked out into the humid night air. Somewhere far off, aircraft engines rumbled. Japanese night raiders. Maybe. The sound made his stomach tighten. He'd broken the rules written to protect machines. Because the rules weren't protecting people. McKenna didn't sleep. He lay on his bunk staring at the ceiling, replaying the installation step by step. If the tension was too high, the cable could snap. If the wire shifted, it could jam the controls. There was no test flight, no simulation, just trust. At 6:30, he walked to the flight line. Hayes's aircraft was already being fueled and armed. The inspection crew moved quickly, focused on engines and ammunition. No one checked cable tension. McKenna said nothing. He watched Hayes walk out for briefing, watched him climb into the cockpit. At 7:42, the P-38 rolled down the runway and lifted into the sky. McKenna stood there, long after it disappeared. There was nothing left to do. At 8:14, the radios crackled with the first contact reports. 16 aircraft, enemy fighters ahead. McKenna listened without breathing. Every second stretched. If the modification failed, it would fail now. If it worked, it would change everything. But McKenna wouldn't know which one until the aircraft came back, or didn't. For 17 minutes, the outcome of a decision made in silence the night before hung somewhere over the jungle, balanced on 6 inches of wire that had never been approved, never been tested, and was never supposed to exist. The engagement began at 8:14. 16 P-38 seconds crossed the coast and climbed toward Japanese airspace. The sun was behind them. Perfect conditions. Hayes flew third position, slightly low, scanning ahead. His hands were steady on the controls, but his stomach was tight. He had been here before. Every time it ended the same way. The call came over the radio: enemy fighters, 12 o'clock high. Zeros. They rolled in. Hayes picked one at the back of the formation and pushed the nose down. Speed built fast, 300, then 380. The zero grew in his gun sight. He squeezed the trigger. The P-38 shuddered as the guns fired. Tracers streaked past. A few sparks flashed on the Zero's wing. Not enough. The Zero, snap, rolled right and dove. Hayes rolled to follow. That was the moment. The stick moved, and the aircraft moved with it. No pause. No drag. No waiting for the airplane to catch up. The P-38 rolled as if it had been released from a restraint it had carried for months. Hayes felt it immediately. Not in his head. In his hands. The aircraft did exactly what he asked, the instant he asked it. He rolled 90 degrees in what felt like half the time he was used to. The Zero was still there. Hayes fired again. A short burst. The rounds walked up the fuselage. The engine exploded. The Zero rolled inverted and fell toward the jungle, trailing black smoke. Hayes didn't cheer. There was no time. His wingman shouted a warning, 3 Zeros diving from above. They had seen the kill. They were coming fast. Hayes pushed the throttles forward and began to climb. The Zeros closed the distance anyway. They had altitude. They had gravity. In every briefing, this was the point where the instruction was clear. Run. But running hadn't saved anyone. Hayes made a different choice. He rolled hard left and pulled. The P-38 snapped around. The maneuver shocked him. The nose came through the horizon so fast he almost overcorrected. The lead Zero tried to follow and failed. It hadn't expected the reversal. For the first time, the timing was wrong. The Zero was exposed. Hayes pulled lead and fired. The rounds hit the wing root. The wing folded. The Zero disintegrated. 2 kills in under 30 seconds. The remaining Zeros tried to scissor, alternating turns to force an overshoot. It was a tactic that had worked for months. Hayes stayed with them. Every time they reversed, his P-38 answered instantly. No lag, no resistance, no fight with the controls. It was like flying a different aircraft. Like someone had removed invisible weights from the system. 1 Zero made a mistake, turned too hard, bled too much speed. Hayes got inside the turn. Range closed to 200 feet. He fired. The Zero came apart. Fragments flashed past Hayes's canopy. The P-38 shuddered as debris struck the right boom. 3 kills. The 4th Zero ran. Hayes didn't chase. Fuel was low. Ammunition was nearly gone. He climbed back to altitude and reformed with what was left of his flight. The entire fight had lasted 7 minutes. On the ground at Doadura, McKenna stood by the runway and watched the P-38 seconds return. He counted them as they came in. 1, 2, 3. Hayes's aircraft appeared last. Intact. McKenna didn't breathe until the wheels touched the ground. At 9-3, Hayes shut down the engines and climbed out. His hands were shaking. His flight suit was soaked with sweat. He walked straight toward McKenna. No one else mattered. Hayes stopped in front of him and said 2 words. It worked. It was. That was all. McKenna nodded once. Around them, other pilots were staring. They had watched the fight from altitude. They had seen something they didn't understand. A P-38 rolling faster than it should, turning harder than it was supposed to. Winning fights it wasn't meant to win. Captain Frank Mitchell had seen everything. From 15,000 feet, he'd watched Hayes's aircraft snap through maneuvers like it weighed half as much. Mitchell knew Hayes. Good pilot. Not a miracle worker. Something had changed. After landing, Mitchell found Hayes in the debriefing room. 3 confirmed kills. Mitchell asked what Hayes had done differently. Hayes shrugged. The airplane just felt better today. Mitchell didn't accept that. He went looking for McKenna. Found him in the maintenance area, hands black with grease, working on another aircraft like nothing had happened. Mitchell asked one question. What did you do to his airplane? In quote. McKenna hesitated, then told him the truth. The wire, the tensioner, the unauthorized modification. Mitchell listened without interrupting. When McKenna finished, Mitchell said something that changed the course of the squadron. Do mine next. You are peace? McKenna warned him. No approval. No testing. If it failed, they'd both be finished. Mitchell didn't care. He had lost 4 pilots in the past month, all in turning fights they couldn't escape. If there was a way to give his men a chance, he wanted it. That evening, McKenna installed the same 6-inch wire in Mitchell's aircraft. The next morning, Mitchell flew it. He came back grinning like a man who'd just discovered a secret the war hadn't told him. By nightfall, word was spreading. Quietly, pilot to pilot, crew chief to crew chief. There was something different about Hayes's P-38. Something inside it. Something small. Something that made the airplane answer. And for the first time in months, pilots began to believe they might not be flying to their deaths anymore. The change didn't spread through orders. There were no briefings, no memos, no signatures. It moved the way dangerous ideas always move in war, quietly, between people who trusted each other. Mitchell flew again the next morning. He came back talking faster than usual. The airplane rolled like it should have from the start. Not twitchy, not unstable, just immediate. His wingman noticed it before Mitchell said a word. The way the aircraft reversed direction, the way it stayed inside turns it had no business surviving. That wingman asked a question he didn't ask officers. What did you change? Yukin said. By sunset, 2 more pilots were asking the same thing. McKenna didn't advertise. He didn't recruit. He warned. This wasn't approved. This wasn't tested. If something went wrong, there would be no protection. The pilots didn't argue. They had watched friends die following rules that didn't protect them either. That night, McKenna installed 2 more tensioners. 6 inches of wire. 8 minutes of work. Nothing visible from the outside. The next day, those 2 pilots came back alive. One with a kill, one with a near miss he would not have survived a week earlier. By the 3rd day, the request didn't come from pilots anymore. It came from crew chiefs. They didn't ask what it did. They asked how to do it. McKenna showed them once. Cut the wire. Bend it into a Z. Install it inline. Test for slack. No paperwork. No names. Just muscle memory. Within a week, 9 P-38 seconds on the line had the modification. Nobody wrote it down. They didn't have to. Everyone who needed to know already knew. There was only one rule. If inspection teams came through, the wire came out. Cable tension checks were part of routine inspections. The numbers had to match the book. So before inspections, crew chiefs pulled the tensioners. After inspections, they put them back. The aircraft passed every check. On paper, nothing had changed. In the air, everything had. Pilots stopped talking about fighting the airplane. They stopped describing turns as guesses. They began to trust the first movement. The Zero pilots noticed before headquarters did. Japanese reports started mentioning P-38 seconds that rolled faster than expected, reversed sooner, didn't bleed energy the way they were supposed to. At first, it was dismissed. Pilot exaggeration. Isolated encounters. Then the losses continued. American pilots started coming back more often. Not untouched, not clean, but alive. The numbers shifted slowly, then faster. In July, P-38 units in the Southwest Pacific were losing aircraft at nearly 2-to-1. By late August, the ratio tightened. By early September, it tipped. Not dramatically. Not enough to make headlines, but enough that someone in an office noticed. Pilots didn't celebrate. They knew better. This wasn't a miracle. It was a correction. They were no longer fighting with a delay built into their hands. Lieutenant Hayes shot down 2 more Zeros a few days later. Mitchell scored 3 on the next engagement. Other pilots, men who had gone weeks without a single confirmed kill, came back with their first. They didn't suddenly become better pilots. They were finally flying aircraft that responded when commanded. Japanese pilots adapted the only way they could. Some stopped trying to turn with P-38 seconds and switched to hit-and-run tactics, but that meant giving up their advantage. The Zero was light and agile. That was its identity. Fighting like a P-38 meant fighting on American terms. Speed, durability, firepower. Others tried aggression, closing range, taking risks. That only shortened the time it took to die. Several experienced Japanese pilots were lost in September, attempting maneuvers that had worked flawlessly in July. The Americans hadn't changed tactics. They hadn't changed doctrine. They had changed something smaller, something hidden. Back at Dodura, the engineering officer noticed irregularities, not in reports. In outcomes, the same aircraft types, the same missions, different results. He ordered additional checks. The numbers still looked correct. Cable tensions were within spec, because when inspections came, the tensioners were gone. The war didn't reward honesty. It rewarded survival. By early September, nearly 40 P-38 seconds across multiple units had the modification. No official acknowledgement. No authorization. Just a network of mechanics and pilots quietly doing what worked. Japanese intelligence took notice. Wreckage was examined. Photographs were compared. Nothing stood out. The aircraft looked the same as the ones they had been killing for months. What they couldn't see was the difference that mattered. It wasn't a new weapon. It wasn't a new engine. It was timing. And timing is invisible until it kills you. By the end of the month, Japanese commanders issued new guidance. Avoid engaging P-38 seconds unless you had a numerical advantage. That order marked a change no one announced publicly. The zero had gone from hunter to cautious opponent. The fix remained unofficial. Because officially, admitting it existed meant admitting something worse. That for months, men had died not because they were wrong, but because the system had been satisfied with acceptable, and that was a truth no manual wanted to carry. Japanese pilots had been winning the same way for months. They didn't rely on speed, they relied on certainty. Against the P-38, certainty came from timing. Zero pilots knew exactly how long it took an American Lightning to roll. They had measured it in fights, not manuals. They waited for the stick input, counted the fraction of a second, then reversed. By the time the P-38 finished turning, the zero was already inside the arc. That timing was the zero's real weapon. And then, late in August, it stopped working. The first reports were vague. Pilots described P-38 seconds that responded faster than expected. To date, Sinaxon's that did not hesitate. Iswan's press that reversed unusually quickly. With mine with the 4, command staff assumed exaggeration. Combat stress, adrenaline, isolated encounters, until experienced pilots started saying the same thing. Lieutenant Commander Saburo Sakai was one of them. Sakai was not guessing. By 1943, he was already a veteran ace. Dozens of kills, 2 years of continuous combat. He didn't survive by luck. He survived by knowing exactly what his enemy could and could not do. On September 3rd, Sakai engaged a P-38 over the New Guinea coast. The setup was familiar. He drew the American into a turning fight, waited for the P-38 to begin its roll, prepared to snap back the opposite direction. He had done this maneuver dozens of times. It had never failed. This time, the P-38 reversed with him. Not late, not wide. With him, Sakai barely avoided a head-on collision. The American got guns on him. Sakai dove away, shaken. Not because he had almost been shot down, because the maneuver he trusted had betrayed him. Back at base, Sakai didn't brag. He didn't complain. He asked questions. How long had the American been in the fight? What altitude? What speed? The answers didn't explain what he had seen. Other pilots reported similar encounters. Different locations. Different squadrons. Same problem. The Americans weren't flying differently. They were flying the same tactics. But the aircraft were answering faster, fractionally, enough to ruin the Zero's advantage. Japanese intelligence began reviewing combat reports. They compared encounters from July to those in late August. The shift was subtle, but it was there. P-38 seconds were surviving maneuvers that had previously been fatal. They were staying inside turns longer. They were reversing sooner. The timing the Japanese had memorized was no longer reliable. That was worse than facing a faster enemy. You can adapt to speed. You can adapt to firepower. You cannot adapt to an enemy whose limits you no longer understand. Japanese mechanics examined wreckage from downed P-38 seconds. They found nothing. Same engines, same armament, same control surfaces. No visible modifications. The aircraft looked identical to the ones they had been killing for months. The change was hidden. Inside the boom, behind panels no one removed on the battlefield. Even if they had found the wire, they might not have understood it. It wasn't a new system. It wasn't a redesign. It was the absence of delay. And absence leaves no signature. By mid-September, Japanese pilots began changing their behavior. Some stopped trying to force turning fights with P-38 seconds. They switched to hit-and-run attacks instead. But that meant giving up what made the Zero dangerous. The Zero was light, agile. Turning fights were its identity. Fighting like an American fighter meant fighting on American terms. Others tried aggression, closing distance faster, taking risks. That only shortened the timeline to disaster. Several experienced Zero pilots were killed attempting maneuvers that had worked perfectly weeks earlier. The confidence that had defined Japanese air superiority began to erode. Pilots hesitated, not for long, just long enough. In air combat, hesitation is fatal. The Americans noticed the change before the Japanese admitted it. Zeros that used to press attacks now disengaged earlier. Zeros that used to dominate turning fights now broke away. The hunter was becoming cautious. Japanese command issued new guidance. Avoid engaging P-38 seconds unless you had numerical superiority. Avoid prolonged turning engagements. The order was careful, quiet, but its meaning was clear. Something had changed. The P-38 was no longer predictable, and unpredictability destroys doctrine. By the end of September, the numbers confirmed what pilots already knew. Japanese losses against P-38 seconds were rising. American losses were falling. Not dramatically, not enough to declare victory, enough to shift momentum. The air war over the Pacific had tilted, not because of a new aircraft, not because of a new tactic, but because a fraction of a second had been taken away. For Zero pilots, the war had become unfamiliar. They were fighting an enemy they could not see, could not measure, could not time, and timing was all they had ever relied on. Back in New Guinea, McKenna never saw the reports. He didn't need to. He saw it in the way pilots walked back from missions, alive, exhausted, quiet. The war hadn't become safe, but it had become survivable, because somewhere inside dozens of aircraft, a delay that had once been acceptable had been quietly removed, and the people on the other side of the sky were paying the price for a mistake they could no longer exploit. Systems don't notice people, they notice numbers. For weeks, the numbers had been changing, not dramatically, not fast enough to trigger alarms, just enough to feel wrong. The same aircraft, the same pilots, the same missions, different outcomes. At Doadura, the engineering officer began to see it in the summaries. Fewer losses, more aircraft returning damaged but returning. The trend didn't match doctrine. According to doctrine, nothing had changed. So the officer ordered deeper checks. Nothing intrusive, nothing aggressive, just more measurements. Cable tensions were logged more carefully. Control linkages were checked twice. Every reading came back clean, within specification. That should have been the end of it. But the outcomes refused to cooperate. Aircraft that should have been struggling were surviving. Pilots who had gone weeks without a kill were suddenly coming back with confirmed victories. The engineering officer suspected pilot behavior, then tactics. He interviewed squadron leaders. They all said the same thing. We're flying the same way. We're doing what we've always done. That answer didn't satisfy him. He ordered surprise inspections, not announced, not scheduled. Crew chiefs heard about them anyway. Word traveled faster than paperwork ever could. When the inspection team arrived, the flight line looked ordinary. Panels were closed. Tools were put away. Cable tensions were measured. Everything matched the book, because before inspections, the tensioners came out, and after inspections, they went back in. The system measured compliance. The crews practiced survival. The breakthrough came by accident. During one inspection, an aircraft was delayed on the line. A crew chief had removed the tensioner, but hadn't yet reinstalled it. The readings were off. Not by much. Enough to raise a question. The engineering officer ordered a teardown. Panels came off. Inside the boom, they found it. A piece of wire, bent, improvised, cleanly installed. Not factory, not authorized. The officer stared at it for a long time. This wasn't sabotage. It wasn't negligence. It was deliberate, and it worked. The report moved up the chain. It didn't move quickly. No one wanted to touch it. Because the question wasn't technical, it was political. If the modification was dangerous, the answer was easy. Court-martial the mechanics. Remove the aircraft. Restore order. But the modification wasn't dangerous. The numbers made that clear. Units using it were losing fewer pilots. Their kill ratios were measurably better. The question wasn't whether the wire helped. The question was what admitting it meant. Admitting it meant admitting that regulations had protected specifications instead of people. That men had died not because they were careless, but because the system had accepted a flaw as tolerable. Many. That no officer had noticed what enlisted mechanics had felt with their hands. The report sat on desks. 3 weeks passed. Pilots continued flying with the modification. Crew chiefs continued hiding it during inspections. No one ordered them to stop. No one ordered them to continue. Silence became policy. In October, Lockheed sent an engineering team to New Guinea. Officially, they were there to evaluate field performance. Unofficially, they were there to answer a question no one wanted to ask out loud. The engineers examined the modification. They measured the cable tension, calculated stress loads, ran flight tests. The results were unambiguous. The modification was safe. More than that, it was correct. The engineers concluded that the control system should have been designed that way from the beginning. The fix was obvious once you saw it, and invisible if you didn't. Lockheed returned to California with the data. They didn't mention McKenna's name. They didn't mention the mechanics who had risked their careers. They didn't mention the pilots who had died before the fix existed. They updated the design. Later P-38 variants incorporated a proper tensioning system. Official documentation credited engineering analysis. 2020. No mention of piano wire. No mention of New Guinea. No mention of unauthorized fixes. The system had absorbed the solution without acknowledging the problem. No one was punished. No one was rewarded. That was intentional. Punishing the mechanics would have exposed the failure. Rewarding them would have confirmed it. So the story was filed away, quietly. By the time the modification became standard, the moment had passed. New pilots arrived flying aircraft that worked the way they always should have. They never felt the delay. They never knew the difference. And because they never knew it, they never asked why earlier pilots had died. James McKenna was never called in, never questioned, never thanked. He went back to his routine. Inspect, tighten, sign the log. He didn't talk about the wire. He didn't need to. The pilots who flew his aircraft came back more often. That was enough. The system moved on. It always does. It took the fix, erased the story, and left the people who made it possible exactly where they had always been. Invisible. Because systems don't celebrate the moment they were wrong. They correct quietly and pretend they were right all along. The war moved on. It always does. New aircraft arrived. New pilots replaced the old ones. The sky filled with machines that no longer carried the delay that had killed so many men in 1943. The P-38 changed. Officially, later variants flew the way Hayes's aircraft had flown that morning in August. Responsive, immediate, predictable in the right way. No one talked about why, because by then there was no reason to. Lieutenant Robert Hayes survived the war. He flew 63 combat missions. He shot down 11 Japanese aircraft. On paper, he became what the manuals said a successful pilot looked like. But Hayes never forgot the moment everything changed. Not the first kill, not the applause, not the statistics. He remembered the instant the airplane answered, the instant the delay vanished. Every year, on August 17th, Hayes called James McKenna. No ceremony, no speech, just a call to say thank you. Captain Frank Mitchell survived too. He kept flying, kept leading men into combat. He lost fewer pilots after the modification spread. That mattered more to him than his own kill count. After the war, Mitchell stayed in the Air Force. He rose in rank. Whenever he supervised young maintenance officers, he told them the same thing. Sometimes the people who see the problem aren't the ones with authority. And sometimes the solution doesn't come from where the organization expects it to. He never named McKenna publicly. He didn't have to. McKenna stayed enlisted until 1946. No commendations, no medals, just a discharge paper and a ticket home. He returned to California and did what he knew how to do. He worked on engines, cars, not airplanes. He opened a small garage in Long Beach in 1948 and spent decades fixing machines for people who never asked what he had done in the war. When they did ask, he shrugged. He was a mechanic. That was all. The official histories didn't mention him. Lockheed's documentation credited engineering teams and design revisions. Maintenance logs listed part numbers, not decisions. The piano wire tensioner never appeared in reports. It existed only in memories and in survival rates. In 1991, a military historian researching P-38 modifications noticed inconsistencies in maintenance records from New Guinea. Cable tensions that didn't match factory norms. Repeated patterns across squadrons. He followed the trail. Eventually, it led him to an aging mechanic still working part-time in his garage. James McKenna was 73 years old when the historian asked him about the wire. McKenna didn't correct him, didn't defend himself. He just said it was something that needed doing. The historian estimated that the modification may have saved between 80 and 100 pilots. McKenna said he never counted. He remembered the ones who came back. That was enough. McKenna died in 2006. He was 88. His obituary mentioned his service in World War II as an aircraft mechanic. It did not mention the wire. It did not mention New Guinea. It did not mention the pilots who lived because he broke the rules. History recorded him exactly the way systems prefer, accurately, incompletely. There is a photograph that still exists. A young man in coveralls standing beside P-38. August Omianoa Sutapatruzech Chitray, New Guinea. Nothing in the image suggests what he did. No hero pose, no ceremony, just a mechanic next to a machine. And that is how innovation actually happens in war. Not through committees, not through approvals, not through manuals written far from the consequences. It happens when someone notices a problem that isn't supposed to exist, feels it with their hands, and decides that following the rules matters less than saving the next person who walks toward the aircraft. The wire was never meant to exist. It violated regulations. It bypassed authority. It embarrassed a system that had already accepted the cost of delay, so the system erased it. But the air war didn't forget, because for a brief period in 1943, a fraction of a second disappeared from American fighters. And when it did, the balance shifted. Not because of a new weapon, not because of a new doctrine, but because one man refused to accept that within tolerance was an acceptable way to die. That is the part history rarely keeps. And that is why stories like this matter, because wars are not only decided by generals and engineers, they are decided by people no one intended to remember, until the consequences make forgetting impossible.